Coast of Devon in England. And this body of water behind me is the English Channel. Now, if this video had a slightly higher budget, what I do now is jump into some kind of speedboat and zip out 12 nautical miles. At which point, I would tell you that we had reached an invisible line. For as long as...
Widescreen. Apparently England fans will get a W1 match ban if we sing 10 German bombers. That's pretty funny. How the irony is that it is coming home, regardless if we win or lose against Germany, because we're at Wembley anyway. We're already home anyway. Can't go somewhere where you're already at, right? It's where they say tell the immigrants to go home. It's like, and they live there. It's like, I am there. Go home. What? What, down the road? Got him. Fucking got him.
As we remained this side of that line, we would remain in the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Cross over that line and we'd be bobbing about in international waters. Bob too far and eventually we'd cross over another invisible line and find ourselves in the jurisdiction of the French Republic. The existence of these invisible lines
right?
and the division of the world up into different countries with different laws and customs is so foundational to so many different aspects of our lives that we often fall into the trap of assuming that it has always been this way. That countries and borders are some kind of natural phenomenon. Yet, as soon as we take a moment to think about it, this obviously isn't the case. Archaeological evidence shows that human beings...
I mean, disrespecting for someone losing isn't...
somewhere between 40 and 45,000 years.
Edgy, isn't it?
And few people would argue that those early humans would have referred to this patch of land as England, or themselves as English. In fact, as we'll see shortly, you wouldn't have to travel anywhere near as far back in time to find a period in which the very concept of a country, particularly in the specific way that we use it in the present...
So I've already watched this video and it's actually really good. I found it quite fascinating how the term nationalism came about, and prior to the 19th, 18th century, the concept of nationalism didn't exist and why it didn't exist. And this video explains how, and I thought it was really interesting.
Baffling to whoever you were talking to. There are plenty of videos and channels on YouTube which tell interesting stories about countries.
Yeah, I thought it was really
customs,
interesting.
Maps and borders. In this video, I want to dig deeper to explore what exactly a country is, the process of their evolution and invention, and finally, what might happen to them in the future. So, before we can begin to discuss the emergence of countries as a means of organising the world around us, we first need to unpack precisely what a country is. And in doing so, I think it's helpful to replace the somewhat vague word country with the slightly more technical term nation-state. For the phrase nation-state, in all its hyphenated goodness, helps to articulate the manner in which what we often think of as a singular phenomenon, a country, is usually actually comprised of two separate phenomena. Let's begin by getting a handle on each of these ideas, the nation and the state, individually. Firstly, what is a nation? Stephen Crosby defines a nation somewhat wordily as a community of kinship, specifically a bounded, territorially extensive, temporally deep community of nativity.
Big words.
For our purposes today, however, it's perhaps enough to borrow Benedict Anderson's description of a nation as an imagined community. The nation thus refers to the community of human beings that we think of when we think of the Polish or the Japanese or the Swazis.
Yeah.
It is the sense of commonality and camaraderie that often exists between people who consider themselves to share a nationality. We see this expressed fairly clearly in international sports, where people are willing to pay huge sums of money and travel thousands of miles to cheer on athletes who they have never met, but who they nonetheless feel an attachment to due to them considering themselves to belong to the same nation. Now, many right-wing political nationalists view nationality as one and the same as ethnicity or race. Others have instead viewed the nation as a more voluntary association.
I should have done that one earlier.
Nationalism. The 19th century thinker Ernest Renan, for example, wrote that a nation was not simply a group determined by the configuration of the earth, but instead a spiritual family, based on a shared feeling of having common glories in the past and a common will in the present. It's this more voluntaristic, civic view of the nation which we often see invoked by liberal politicians, such as in descriptions of America as a nation of immigrants. Either way, the imagined community of the nation is given substance by both the shared sense of a shared history, described by Renan, and the notion of a shared culture. The songs, stories, food, attitudes, character traits, and anything else that might come to be described as French or Argentine or Madagascar. This sense of community and identity provided by nationality is deeply important to a lot of people. In fact, it's pretty much taken as a given that all of us should feel ourselves to be members of one of these imagined communities.
No, I don't describe myself as patriotic or nationalistic or not necessarily proud of my country either. But I can't help it when like England play and then everyone else is kind of like feeling patriotic too. You almost like become a part of the crowd and you feel almost compassionate towards the crowd and what is happening, even though I don't necessarily have these as my core beliefs. And I think it's built into us. I think that part of the monkey brain, the tribe man, the club my enemy tribe kind of thing, built into our brains is what kind of like enables us to be still tribalistic, even when it doesn't make logical sense anymore. Yep.
As Anderson writes, it is simply assumed that in the modern world, everyone can, should, will have a nationality as one has a gender.
I wonder if
Despite
I can get
this,
Lend-Lease for
these
anyone.
communities are, and can only ever be, imagined. Even in a tiny country such as Nauru, with its estimated population of just 9,770, no individual can hope to ever have a meaningful relationship with every other person who considers
yeah, it is the
to
monkey
be
brain.
Nauru. Furthermore,
it is
the perception that the imagined
I think we recognize
community of the nation
our tribal colors. We recognize our tribal anthem, the song that we sing, and we feel only compelled to be a part of it as a unit. I think when we're in our own and we're individuals, it's kind of scary because you feel lonely and isolated and you don't have an identity. But the brilliance of the state is that it gives you them flag, those colors, that anthem to sing, and people to be around that feel the same way. And that feels very inclusive, and it also feels like you're part of something bigger than yourself. And that takes away that loneliness. I think that's the reason why people do find themselves becoming nationalistic, patriotic.
Is an expression of shared interests, elides deep inequalities and exploitation between its members. Before we go any further, however, it's useful to introduce the second aspect of our nation-state formula, the state. If, in relation to our everyday understanding of what a country is, the nation refers to the ideas stuff of community and culture, the state refers to the political apparatus. Depending on which country one has in mind, the state might include the parliament or congress, the monarch, president or supreme leader, the court system, the police, the army, schools, the civil service.
Oh my God, he's
tax
adaptable
office,
already.
in some
Holy
cases,
shit.
the press and or religious institutions.
It's because he was already
As
a desert fox.
States can take many, many different forms.
Is there a hotkey to like pause? Is there a hotkey to like pause a YouTube video when you're not watching
The defining
it?
feature that all
I know it's space
share
when you're watching
is that,
the window.
As the German sociologist Max Weber put it, the state is the only human community that successfully claims a monopoly of legitimate physical violence for itself within a certain geographical.
One thing I will say, I've heard this expression before, monopoly of legitimate violence. And you have to understand that when people hear the word violence, they presume like hitting, punching, assault, attack. When the actual dictionary definition of violence is a lot more broad. So don't get misled by that.
Territory. By this, Weber does not mean that all states are constantly engaged in physical violence, but that the state is defined by its ability to settle disputes through arresting, imprisoning, or otherwise inflicting violence on people without having to answer to a higher body. I would wager that when most people think of a country in the present day, it is a nation-state which they are thinking of. A political unit in which a single state governs a single nation. This is in spite of the fact that when we look at the world around us, we find numerous examples in which there is not such a clean alignment between these two phenomena. In Scotland, Catalonia and Quebec, to name but a few, we find examples of nations which do not have their own states. In a slightly different mode, Northern Ireland is presently governed as part of the United Kingdom.
I was unlucky, it was right next to when
many
it
who
was
live
auto-saving.
there consider themselves to belong to the nation of Ireland. Across the world, and for many, many different reasons, we see similar disconnects between nation and state. Yet, these exceptions generally only go to show how ingrained the idea that nations and states should go together is. For in each of these places, we find
that's one thing I should have done wrong. I should have gone for guerrilla fire from the get-go.
Success, a shift towards that perceived norm. There is a lot to be said about how nations and states interact. We could, for example, foreground the fact that when a country goes to war, it is generally because it is in the interests of the state to do so. Nevertheless, few people are willing to lay down their lives for the tax office. The state will therefore lean on people's
It's appearing on screen.
With the imagined community
the
of
pause
the nation
for the YouTube video, but it doesn't actually do anything.
As an opportunity for the nation to claim glory, settle scores, or act as saviour to the oppressed, all of which are far more appealing invitations to enlist. We'll certainly touch upon some of the ways in which states and nations interact a little later in this video. For the most part, however, I want to focus on how these two phenomena came to be seen as so inseparable. Which I guess means it's time for a little history lesson.
Whoa, history? I hate history.
The first thing that we need to establish in trying to tell the story of the nation-state is which came first. I think the manner in which modern states so heavily dress themselves
thanks for the sub, dude. Appreciate that, Luco. Thank you for the Twitch Prime. Thank you for giving money for a tiny, insignificant streamer like Feedback Gaming. I appreciate that, my dude. I love you.
Go to a country's national museum or look through their school curricula, and you will often find that they begin telling the story of their nation.
Given to the little guy. What a lad. Can we get Luco G in the chat? Luco G is the G. Oh, fuck
in some ways, always been there.
This shit writes itself.
A notion which is particularly problematic in the case of...
What about Desperate Defense? Desperate Defense is good.
Broadly,
it just...
This can lead us to the assumption that the concept of the nation is an eternal one.
It's good.
That people have always considered themselves.
Yeah, it's good. It's just if you're already losing,
and that the state merely
it's not really going to help you that much.
For those
It'll let you hold on for an extra day, probably.
Or be governed. Some scholars have argued that this is the case.
Where's my civvy gone?
Subscribers to a view of nations referred to as primordialism hold that, as Umut Özkarimli puts it, nationality is a natural part of human beings, as natural as speech, sight or smell, and that nations have existed since time immemorial. Others, collectively known as ethno-symbolists, argue that, whilst it is wrong to describe nations as a natural phenomenon, nations have existed in one form or another for a considerable matter of time.
Well, the first
Anthony D. Smith, for example, writes that
part
we find in pre-modern
of repenting
eras,
is admitting what mistake you made. What mistake did you make?
To the modern idea of national identity and character.
What was the mistake
Today,
you
however,
made, my son?
We're going to take what's called a modernist position, which seeks to stress that, whilst there might have been parallels to nations throughout history, the forms of collective identity which existed in the ancient and pre-modern worlds were not quite the same as those which we describe as nationality in the present.
Your memes are usually really good, actually. I'm actually surprised that you pushed the line.
For some time. Different researchers propose different societies as having developed the first state.
I don't have an artillery.
Francis Fukuyama, for example, awards this title to the Qin dynasty, following its establishment of a centralized government in China in 221 BCE.
Good news, it's only 24 hours, my dude. You'll survive. I believe in you.
Locating the earliest states in the southern alluvium of Mesopotamia, near modern-day Basra, in around 4000 BCE. Such disagreements are partly a result of different definitions of what should count as a state, but the matter is also complicated by the fact that...
I just want to say something. You know, like, you guys might watch Oversimplified and stuff. The reason why Oversimplified videos are so much better than this guy's videos is because they Oversimplified have jokes in them, even if they're really bad jokes. And I'll admit, in Oversimplified, the jokes are very bad, but the jokes break up the video and make it more digestible. This is giving me indigestion.
After their first appearance,
it's educational.
It still took
it's very slow. Oh, it's very slow.
For states to really catch on. See, viewing things from the present day, most people would probably view the emergence of the state as an undeniable good. It's certainly unlikely that you would be able to watch this video, or that I would have had the tools to make it, had our ancestors not taken those first steps towards a more complex way of living. This view is encouraged by the social contract theories of governance forwarded by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes, which imagine our being governed by states to be the outcome of a voluntary trade-off, in which we give up some aspects of our liberty in return for safety and stability. In reality, as Scott argues in his 2017 book Against the Grain, early states were founded on coercion and exploitation. They were often politically chaotic and were breeding grounds for disease. In short, if given the choice, and many people weren't, submitting oneself to the jurisdiction of a state would
to
have
retreat
rarely
effectively, you've got to kind of mash the right mouse button.
Formalised ways of living. It's for these reasons, among others, that states didn't
they
truly
reinforce
become
really
a
slowly because I don't have
dominant presence
radio.
in the world until around the 1600s. One key event,
the
often
slow
highlighted
reinforce
by
really is
historians of
painful.
Europe, is the Peace of Westphalia, a set of two
go
peace
for this
treaties
one,
signed in
but-
1648 to bring an end to the 30 Years' War. A key cause of that conflict, which led to somewhere between 4.5 and 8 million deaths, was the manner in which political and religious jurisdictions in Europe often overlapped and conflicted.
You've almost got a plan like ahead.
On top of this,
and like
countries were
retreat them way in
constantly
advance.
trying to interfere in the domestic affairs of
Total
other
mobilization.
countries, particularly with regard to religious issues. In order to address this, writes Daniel
recovery rate's a
Philpott,
good one.
Westphalia made the sovereign state the legitimate political unit.
bollocks.
It established the precedent that states had the exclusive right to set laws within
This is actually
their
really
territory.
difficult, you know. It's not as
Whilst
easy
the
as you
sovereign
think.
states of the
You've got to
17th
time all this
century
really
may have
well.
begun to resemble modern-day states, however, they were not yet nation-states. See, across the globe, the states of the 17th century were largely monarchies or empires. If there was an identity which accompanied the state, it was simply that of the king, queen, emperor or empress. While some people might have supported their ruler and recognised themselves as living in their territory, that monarchical identity isn't really one that was available to anyone
I
other
think
than the
radio
monarch
early
and
on is
maybe
actually
their
an
close
advantage.
family to feel a cohesive part of. The dominant mode of communal identity in this period was instead that of the religious community. Whilst this might have manifested physically in one's local place of worship, in terms of mental conception, these communities took little heed of national borders. To be a Christian, Muslim or Buddhist, regardless of sect or denomination, meant imagining oneself as part of a near global community which was open to membership by anyone, no matter where they were born. To consider the emergence of the modern country then, we have to take into account the invention of the nation. But before we do that, I must first tell you about today's video sponsor, Surfshark.
Isn't it really nice when they put a timestamp in for the ad so you can just skip the whole ad right to the end? Isn't that really nice of them? I've been told by sponsors never to do that because they know that's what viewers do. So I'm really surprised to actually see that in the video. You might get told off for that. Oh shit, I minimized for a second!
In the 18th and 19th centuries, for monarchical and religious identities to be replaced by the imagined communities of nations. The most abrupt of these events were the revolutions in America and France during the late 1700s. The former saw a group of people gain their independence from a king, and the latter saw a group of people exiled.
It's too late, it is.
Unless they were to install
Oh no.
monarchs, this left them with a quandary.
Oh no.
See,
I think
the
I
state's
fucked it,
sovereignty,
boys.
which we discussed a moment ago, was invested directly
Viewers just skip
in
it.
the monarch or
Yeah,
king.
but if you've got
Hence
timestamps,
are
you've got an
sometimes
extra
referring to such
advantage.
figures as sovereigns. Where was a state to gain its legitimacy and its
Desperate
identity
defend.
from,
Oh, I did Last
if
Stand.
not from
I
an
very
individual
rarely do Last
rule?
Stand.
Well, in both America and France, independence, we begin to see some interesting language being used to describe the post-revolutionary settlement. The United States Declaration of Independence declares that governments are instituted.
Ooh, look how much damage that division took because it last standard. This is why I don't like last stand.
The Declaration
it's the one instance where it's relevant, though.
Citizen
That's the one instance that actually is a really good idea.
Essentially the source of all sovereignty. In both instances, then, we find the idea that rather than stemming from a monarch, a state's sovereignty and legitimacy comes from the people or the nation. Who was included in that people or nation and whose consent to be governed was actually taken into consideration was, of course, another matter. It would be another 87 years before the abolition of slavery in the United States, and women didn't gain the right to vote in France until 1944. Nevertheless, in these declarations, we find the germ of the idea that rather than being identified with an individual ruler and their dynasty, the state might be the political expression of something called a nation. Of course, a handful of rich guys declaring that such a thing as a nation exists didn't suddenly mean that everyone felt a deep connection to the national imagined community of the territory in which they lived. That process, in America, France, and elsewhere, took much, much longer, and was influenced by several other
that new
political,
hat
religious,
DLC
social,
that's
and
coming out. I'm
economic
so excited for that, guys. It's
One
going to be
such
so much
trend,
fun.
which predated these revolutions, was the growth of what Benedict Anderson calls print capitalism. See, where the early publishing industry had mostly printed books.
Yeah, I'm so
Latin
hyped for that, guys. It's going to be so much fun.
Educated. From the 16th century onwards, they began to print more and more volumes in vernacular languages.
Yeah, the Officer Corps, I think it's called.
In their day-to-day lives.
Thanks for subscribing.
This had a couple of important effects. Firstly,
converted from a Twitch Prime to a Tier 1 sub. I didn't even know you could even do that.
A single
Thank you, my
country
dude. I
could
appreciate
contain
that.
dozens of different dialects.
Thank you, my dude.
Eric Hobsbawm highlights that at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, 50% of Frenchmen did not speak French at all.
This is really, really interesting, this. In 1789, so that's the start of the French Revolution, wasn't it? Only 50% of French people spoke French. And only 12 to 13% spoke it by the national standard, how it should be spoken. That's really interesting, that, isn't it? So that reflects that nationalism could not exist prior to the printing press, because people universally did not speak the language, and they did not speak it universally the same way. So you had basically like hundreds of dialects of French, and then 50 or so other languages mixed in with French as well, creating this whole new, I don't know, I guess, mixture, I suppose. So that's why nationalism could not exist, because the idea of a national identity needed to be what are the core elements, such as language.
12 to 13% spoke it correctly. The printed word, however,
the printing press is like such a big invention of human history.
Important within a certain territory,
it's such a massive impact.
At the same time, standardizing how that language was written and spoken. Secondly, the production of books for a certain linguistic community or proto-nation contributed to the cultivation of a shared national culture. Ernest Gellner highlights that the development of this shared culture was rarely democratic. Instead, he writes, it most often manifested as the general imposition of a high culture on society, where previously low cultures had taken up the lives of the majority. In short, he suggests that the localized folk cultures of ordinary poor people were often wiped out as political and economic elites established.
I like that the Democratic Party of Ethiopia is called the Woyan Rebellion.
This is perhaps a simplification. However, Gellner's foregrounding of
you get
power
democracy,
dynamics
guys.
at play in who got to decide what the shared national culture looked like is instructive. For, among other things, Gellner points to the shift towards a school-transmitted culture rather than a folk-transmitted culture as being another key force in the development of nations. During the 18th and 19th centuries, many countries began to establish some form of state education. This again helps to establish a greater degree of cultural consistency across a territory, but also ensured that it was the state, and by extension those wealthy enough to be allowed to vote, that got to decide how a
That's the most
nation's
democratic
past,
party.
present and future was taught, which artistic and literary works were included in syllabi, and thus what the substance of the national culture was. In fact, where earlier I suggested that there was an inconsistency between the idea that the source of a country's sovereignty was the people, and the limited number of those people that actually got a say in how a country was run in this period, Hobsbawm suggests that this might be the whole point. For while such ideas were useful to the emerging bourgeoisie in legitimising their overthrow of monarchs, when the dust settled, they turned out to be far less keen on sharing power with the working class than their initial pronouncements might have suggested. The idea of the nation, argues Hobsbawm, thus became a manner in which the state, which again operated in service of its wealthy electorate, could maintain or even establish the obedience, loyalty and cooperation of its subjects or members, or its own legitimacy in their eyes. Alongside guiding the development of already emerging processes then, Hobsbawm suggests that there was also a fairly naked trend of inventing traditions as a means of further fostering allegiance to the nation. Thus the vogue for adopting national anthems and national holidays during the 19th century. Nevertheless, the idea of the nation turned out to be more than a passing fad.
Yeah, I'm reminding
With
the Italians to
startling
attack me.
velocity, the nation-state became the accepted ideal for what a country should look like and how it should operate. We see this in the anti-colonial movements which gained momentum during the 20th century, most of which expressed themselves in
colonies
national terms. Where the British had usually referred to India as a subcontinent, for example, the struggle for independence was led by the Indian National Congress. Partha Chatterjee warns against assuming that previously colonised countries merely mimicked the national forms of their former colonisers. He writes instead that the most powerful...
I think the biggest difference in nationalism today compared to like the French Revolution and the American Revolution and probably a lot of dates leading up to today is that nationalism today can come on many different forms. It doesn't have to be a language identity or an ethnic identity. It can be an identity based upon what beliefs these people have. For instance, the people in America, there's a mixture of French, Spanish, English, and probably a bunch of other languages, smaller ones baked in as well. And ethnicities are very, very diverse in America as well. But they all have core beliefs based on like the Constitution. So their nationalistic beliefs followed more towards the laws and policies of that nation regarding their ethnicity or language, for instance, or culture. But then again, you could argue American culture is a thing, isn't it? Yeah.
As well as the most creative results of the nationalist imagination in Asia and Africa, are posited not on an identity, but rather on a difference with the modular forms of the national
I know that's the meme.
society
American
propagated
culture,
by the
Omega
modern
lol.
West. Nevertheless,
you guys
these
are going to
movements
do
did
the
operate
meme.
on the broad assumption
You
that an
guys are gonna
independent
do the
state
meme.
should draw its legitimacy
Culture,
from its
Omega
relationship
lol.
with the imagined community of the nation.
Behave,
And this scenario
okay,
has pretty much
behave.
continued into the present day. A sentiment that runs throughout the scholarly literature on nations and nationalism is that belief in both the existence of nations and the idea that nations and states should be congruent
We
is
call
so
ourselves
widespread
Yankees.
that
I
it almost
think
goes
that's an out-of-date
unquestioned.
term. I've never heard that used
But let's close out this video
universally as of
by
today.
briefly exploring that.
I could be wrong, but I'm almost certain that's like a term.
For the most part in this
World
video,
Without
I want to
Countries.
focus on the history of our
Like the John
contemporary
Lennon song
understanding
in the
of
background.
countries and how we got to where we are today. Nevertheless, I always like to end with a bit of a provocation. And so I thought I'd wrap things up by saying a few words about the potential futures
Imagine
of
there's
nations,
no countries.
states, sovereignty, borders and countries.
Isn't
In
hard if you
2018, The
try.
Guardian published an essay by Rana Dasgupta, who wrote that the most momentous development of our era is the waning of the nation-state, its inability to withstand countervailing 21st century forces, and its calamitous loss of influence over human circumstances. He suggests that Despite a resurgence in nationalistic posturing by figures such as Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi and Viktor Orban, the nation-state...
I feel like it's more slang than a unified term. It's very unlikely that someone in the United Nations is going to stand up and say, "Us Yankees,
in fact,
we stand up for each other." Some bullshit, you know what I mean?
The death throes of the nation-state, a final hurrah by
Yankees
governments
like us.
desperate to prove what everyone doubts.
I don't know why, but when I hear the term Yankee, I think of like a Texan with a big
assessment, and there is a great
with a
deal
big
of truth
cowboy
to it.
hat.
For one,
he's like an
we
oil
live in a world
baron.
of gigantic corporations. If Walmart were a country, it would have the 26th largest national economy in the world, with its annual revenue exceeding the GDPs of
the best
Thailand,
country.
Nigeria,
Walmart is my city.
Austria and Ireland. Such companies have also become adept at playing countries off against one another in order to secure the best deal with regard to taxation and regulation. This has, at time of writing, led to the Biden administration pushing for the adoption of a global minimum corporation tax. The need for states to work together in such a way further highlights their individual powerlessness. And in more formal models of international collaboration, such as the European Union, we find an even clearer ceding of sovereignty to supranational institutions. While such analyses ably summarise things as viewed from the perspective of the states, however, they elide the view from below. For whilst capital and people living in the global north can, pandemics aside, move around the world in an increasingly frictionless manner, and thus imagine themselves to be living in an interconnected...
That's right, I've been living under a rock.
That experience and that imaginary are not open to all. To point to one very basic way in which this is true, regardless of their personal feelings about nationality, people who are legal residents of many countries in Asia and Africa will simply find it much harder to cross a national border due to the passport that they hold. Furthermore, many of the resurgent nationalisms that Das Gupta suggests reveal the weaknesses of the state have led to increasingly authoritarian...
So this is a little bit of a cheese. It's kind of an afterthought by the devs. So if you're playing a country that has a generic focus tree and you start out as non-aligned, what you can do is go down the path of militarism, military youth, and then if you want to go communist or democratic after when you've gone for the nationalist focus. Yeah, because I'm going democratic right now, but I've got the bonuses for militarism and military youth, which I will soon anyway. Yeah, there you go.
Borders. We thus find ourselves in a position where the world looks increasingly borderless and cosmopolitan to those at the top, whilst for those at the bottom,
defeat the colonizers.
More broadly, we have to acknowledge how resilient the nation-state form has proven. People have been predicting its downfall almost from the moment of its birth, and yet still it remains central to the way in which we think about the world around us. Whilst it is likely that the nation-state form will persist for some time, however,
Siberian oil baron,
from being far more critical about the naturalness of nations, the legitimacy of states, and the manner in which both those phenomena are wielded in our collective discourse. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it's been worthy.
Alright guys, anyone got any educational videos you guys could link me and we could have fun watching them together?